America, Texas, a small quiet town with peaceful streets, school buses in the morning, Sunday prayers, family dinners, everything seemed normal. But what happened in the spring of 2021 shattered that illusion forever. Behind one of those doors, among ordinary kids and tired parents, lived a 13-year-old boy whose name now sends chills down spines. Evan Taylor was, on the surface, just an ordinary boy living in a quiet Texas town, a place where the days blended together in a comforting routine of school, family dinners, and weekend activities. But beneath this ordinary exterior was a young boy drifting quietly through life, largely invisible to those around him. He was a quiet child, withdrawn and unassuming, blending into the background so thoroughly that most people barely noticed his presence. He was not the star student or the class clown. Instead, he was the kind of child teachers would label as troubled but harmless, a phrase that masked the deeper struggles simmering within him. At school, Evan found himself struggling to keep up. His grades were mediocre and he often appeared distracted or lost in thought during lessons. He rarely volunteered answers or took part in class discussions, and when teachers tried to engage him, their efforts met with silence or vague responses. Evan's lack of academic success was not due to a lack of intelligence, but rather the emotional and social burdens he carried, making it difficult for him to focus or find motivation. Socially, Evan was isolated. He had almost no friends. His attempts to reach out to peers were met with indifference or subtle exclusion. He was often seen walking the halls alone, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact. Lunchtime was a time of solitude, spent on the fringes of the bustling cafeteria rather than at a table with friends. There was no laughter around him, no welcoming smiles, only a persistent sense of being unseen. This absence of social connection only deepened Evan's sense of loneliness. Children his age crave companionship and acceptance, but Evan's experience was the opposite, a daily reminder of how easily one can be overlooked and forgotten. At home, Evan's world was no kinder. The coldness he faced there was not the kind measured by a thermometer, but a deep, emotional chill. His father was frequently away on business trips, leaving the household devoid of his presence for long stretches of time. When his father was home, he was often distracted by work and rarely engaged with Evan in meaningful ways. The absence of a strong paternal figure left a void in Evan's life, a lack of guidance and support that many children take for granted. Evan's mother was physically present but emotionally distant. She spent much of her time absorbed by the television, more interested in the programs flickering on the screen than in the boy sitting silently in the same room. Conversations were minimal and often one-sided. When Evan mustered the courage to ask simple questions or seek attention, his efforts were met with silence or dismissive responses. The warmth and nurturing environment that a child needs to grow confident and secure was absent, replaced by an unspoken neglect that slowly eroded Evan's sense of self-worth. This emotional neglect cast a long shadow over Evan's childhood. Without encouragement or affection from his family, he retreated inward, building walls around himself to protect against the pain of rejection and invisibility. His days were marked by a quiet desperation, a yearning for connection that seemed always out of reach. The very people who should have been his anchors in a confusing world were absent in the ways that mattered most. This lack of emotional nourishment left Evan vulnerable and isolated, searching for any glimmer of hope or acceptance that might fill the void. Despite his withdrawn nature, Evan was not without hope. Like any child, he longed for friendship, understanding, and a sense of belonging. These needs, however, went unmet in the safe spaces he should have known. The stark contrast between his desires and his reality created an emotional chasm, making him an easy target for influences that promised what he lacked. It was within this fragile state that someone appeared, someone who offered Evan what he desperately sought: attention, acceptance, and a place to belong. This person was not a friend in the traditional sense, but rather the gateway to a world that promised belonging and purpose, though at a cost Evan did not understand. The arrival of this figure marked a turning point in Evan's life. For the first time, he felt noticed and valued. The group this person introduced him to presented themselves as a community, a family for those who felt lost or abandoned. They spoke of enlightenment, cleansing, and transformation, offering rituals and ceremonies that held a strange allure for a boy desperate to feel important and connected. What seemed like an offer of friendship was, in reality, the beginning of a dark journey. The group's teachings were far from benign. Their ideology centered on obscure beliefs and demands for absolute loyalty. The rituals were unsettling, filled with symbolism that promised power and belonging but required submission and obedience. Evan, hungry for acceptance, embraced these teachings without fully grasping their implications. The emotional hunger that had driven him to seek connection made him susceptible to manipulation. Slowly, the boy who had once been quiet and withdrawn began to change, adopting the language, symbols, and behaviors of this new world. His isolation deepened as he distanced himself from his previous life. The community that had once ignored him was replaced by one that demanded his complete allegiance. The warmth he had sought was twisted into a bond forged through control and fear. The vulnerability that had made Evan a target was now exploited, leading him down a path where his identity became enmeshed with the dark beliefs of the group. This transformation was gradual but profound. Evan's demeanor grew more secretive, his expressions harder to read. The boy who once walked the halls alone now carried with him the weight of hidden rituals and ominous symbols. Those who tried to reach out found a barrier that had not existed before, a new loyalty that shielded him from outside influence. The emotional void at home remained, but now it was filled with a dangerous sense of purpose that alienated him further from those who cared. The story of Evan Taylor is a poignant reminder of how emotional neglect and isolation can push a child toward dangerous influences. His journey from a quiet, overlooked boy to a member of a shadowy group underscores the critical importance of connection, understanding, and intervention. Without the support of family, friends, and community, even ordinary children can become vulnerable to forces that seek to exploit their pain. Evan's story is a stark illustration of the consequences when a child's need for belonging goes unmet, and a warning of the dark places that loneliness can lead when left unchecked. They called themselves the Children of the Primordial Light, a name that suggested ancient wisdom and spiritual awakening. To outsiders, they appeared as a small youth group dedicated to guiding young people toward inner peace and connection with the natural world. Their public message was simple and appealing. They taught children to hear the voice of nature and clear their minds, promoting meditation, mindfulness, and a sense of harmony with the environment. This surface-level appearance masked a much darker reality. The group operated largely in secrecy, meeting behind closed doors in a dilapidated shed located on the fringes of the town, far from the watchful eyes of neighbors and authorities. The rundown building seemed innocuous, perhaps even forgotten, but inside it was the center of chilling ceremonies that defied the tranquil facade they projected. Within the shadowy confines of this meeting place, the Children of the Primordial Light engaged in horrific rituals that starkly contrasted with their outward image. These ceremonies involved acts that disturbed anyone who might have stumbled upon them. Animal sacrifices were commonplace, with small creatures offered up in what the group claimed were acts of purification and spiritual cleansing. The blood spilled was said to be a necessary gift to their deity, a figure they named Rovalem. This mysterious entity occupied a central place in their belief system, regarded as the true god before mankind, an ancient being who existed before the dawn of human history. Ra-Valem was believed to demand offerings of blood to purify the world from filth, a phrase that encapsulated their dark worldview. To members of the group, the world was seen as corrupted and impure, a place needing cleansing through these violent sacrifices. The rituals extended beyond sacrifices. Members of the Children of the Primordial Light bore strange scars, marks carefully carved into their skin during ceremonies. These scars were symbols of their commitment and initiation, serving as permanent reminders of their loyalty to Ra-Valem and the group's cause. The act of inflicting these marks was both a physical and psychological initiation, binding members together through shared pain and secret knowledge. The scars were secretive emblems, hidden from outsiders, but potent within the group's culture, marking each member as part of something larger and more powerful than themselves. Evan Taylor, the young boy who had struggled with loneliness and neglect, found himself drawn into this unsettling world. For the first time in his life, he experienced something he had long been missing: attention. The children of the primordial light called him by name, acknowledged his presence, and treated him as someone important. The simple act of recognition filled a void that had grown deep within him. Unlike the indifference he'd faced at school and at home, this group made him feel seen and valued. They entrusted him with tasks, duties that were terrifying in their nature but presented clearly and without ambiguity. These assignments were tests of loyalty, demanding obedience and the shedding of old fears and doubts. To Evan, whose world had been defined by invisibility and neglect, these clear expectations were a relief. The certainty, the structure, and the promise of belonging gave him a sense of purpose. Within the group, Evan found a semblance of family, something he had never known in his fractured home life. The children of the primordial light offered him a place to belong, a community bound by shared rituals and beliefs. They became the first group to truly accept him, even if their acceptance came at a steep and dangerous price. His readiness to do anything to belong, to be part of something, made him vulnerable to the influence and control wielded by the group's leaders. The need for acceptance overshadowed any lingering doubts or fears he might have had. The rituals and demands that outsiders would view as horrific became, for Evan, rites of passage into a new identity. A transformation from the neglected boy he had been into a committed member of the children of the primordial light. This transformation was as much psychological as it was physical. The group's teachings rewired Evan's perceptions, replacing his previous sense of self with one aligned to the dark mythology of Ra Valem and the primordial light. The rituals that once might have repelled him became sources of comfort and affirmation. The pain of the scars carved into his skin was not a punishment, but a symbol of strength and belonging. The blood sacrifices, the secret ceremonies, and the shared beliefs created a powerful bond that isolated him further from his previous life. Each step deeper into the group's world pulled him away from the boy who had once sought only simple kindness and companionship. Evan's journey into the children of the primordial light illustrates the dangerous power of belonging and acceptance when offered by groups with sinister agendas. His vulnerability was exploited by those who cloaked their intentions in spirituality and ancient rites, using the promise of family and purpose to ensnare a lonely child. What began as an innocent search for connection became a descent into a world where morality was redefined and darkness masked as light. The group's influence on Evan was total. His mind, once a place of quiet retreat and hidden pain, became filled with the group's doctrine and commands. The simple boy who had felt invisible was now part of something grandiose, terrifying, and secret. He was willing to sacrifice his previous identity and eventually to follow orders that would have horrific consequences. The children of the primordial light were not just a group offering friendship. They were a force that reshaped a vulnerable boy's entire existence, binding him to a fate from which there was no easy escape. Weeks slipped by, and Evan's transformation unfolded quietly but unmistakably. The boy who had once been merely withdrawn became increasingly distant, as if retreating into a world no one else could reach. His silence grew heavier, more impenetrable. Gone were the faint attempts at conversation or small smiles he had occasionally offered. In their place was a brooding stillness that unsettled those around him. At school, teachers noticed the change but dismissed it as typical teenage moodiness or the lingering effects of the social isolation he'd long endured. His classmates gave him curious glances but continued to avoid him, unsure how to approach someone so clearly withdrawn. More troubling, however, were the visible signs of Evan's inner turmoil. Cuts began appearing on his wrists, precise and deliberate, shaped into strange symbols that defied explanation. These marks puzzled even the school counselor, a professional trained to identify warning signs in vulnerable youths. Attempts to discuss the injuries with Evan were met with silence or vague denials, leaving adults frustrated and increasingly concerned. The scars were not random self-harm, but seemed ritualistic, deliberate engravings tied to something beyond mere emotional distress. Yet, the true meaning behind these carvings remained a mystery to those trying to help. Alongside these physical changes came new accessories and habits that further alienated Evan from his peers and family. He began wearing a pendant, a small skull delicately wrapped in threads of dark fabric, that he claimed offered protection from evil spirits. To outsiders, the charm was unsettling, a grim token that marked him as different, as if he had entered a world far removed from the everyday life of a typical teenager. This pendant became a constant presence around his neck, a talisman that seemed to reinforce his growing separation from the normalcy of school and home. Evan's speech, once sparse and cautious, now carried an unsettling tone. He began repeating phrases that echoed the teachings of the group he had joined, words that revealed a mind absorbed in dark ideology. Phrases like, "This world is fake," and "Revelum will soon cleanse it of hypocrites," slipped from his lips in quiet moments, sometimes spoken aloud when no one was around to hear. These expressions, cryptic and ominous, were dismissed by adults as the ramblings of a confused child or ignored as mere adolescent angst. Teachers noted the oddity but focused on academic issues. Parents, overwhelmed or distracted by their own lives, failed to see the deeper warning signs. Neighbors whispered but seldom intervened, chalking up Evan's odd behavior to the typical trials of growing up. The pattern of neglect and misunderstanding created a dangerous environment around Evan. His cries for help were silent and coded, embedded in symbols, objects, and phrases that only those versed in his new beliefs could comprehend. Yet the adults in his life lacked the awareness or knowledge to recognize the true depth of his entanglement. The community's inability to grasp what was unfolding allowed Evan's transformation to proceed unchecked, deepening his isolation and binding him ever tighter to the shadowy influence of the children of the primordial light. As the weeks progressed, Evan's world became increasingly insular. The rituals and teachings of the group filled the void left by absent family support and social alienation. The symbols carved into his skin were badges of membership, rites of passage that connected him to a dark and secretive community. His pendant was a shield, a visible token of allegiance and protection against perceived enemies both real and imagined. His repeated phrases were mantras, reinforcing a belief system that distorted reality and justified a growing detachment from the world around him. No one around Evan understood that beneath the surface was a boy slowly unraveling, caught in a web of manipulation and control. His physical scars were manifestations of his psychological pain, marks that told a story no one was willing or able to hear. The words he repeated were not mere eccentricities, but signals of a profound internal shift, an adoption of a worldview that would soon demand actions beyond anyone's imagination. The indifference and disbelief of those who might have intervened played a crucial role in Evan's descent. Teachers saw a troubled child but lacked the resources or training to address the underlying issues. Parents, absorbed in their own struggles, overlooked the signs until it was too late. Neighbors, comfortable in their routines, chose silence over suspicion. This collective failure left Evan adrift, a vulnerable soul sinking deeper into darkness. The changes in Evan were more than just behavioral oddities. They were warnings of a tragedy in the making. The scars, the pendant, the cryptic phrases, all were pieces of a puzzle that no one assembled until the consequences became impossible to ignore. The boy who had once been quiet and invisible was transforming into something alien and dangerous, shaped by forces that exploited his need for belonging and meaning. This period of Evan's life stands as a chilling testament to how easily a vulnerable child can slip through the cracks when those around him fail to see beyond the surface. It underscores the critical importance of vigilance, understanding, and early intervention in the lives of youths at risk. Had someone recognized the signs sooner, the course of Evan's story and that of the community might have been drastically different. But in the weeks that passed, as Evan wore his scars and repeated his mantras, the darkness grew. The boy who once asked, "How are you?" with a hopeful heart, had become a shadow of himself, lost in a world where light was defined by blood and obedience, where belonging demanded sacrifice, and where the only voice he heard was that of Ra-Velem, whispering promises of cleansing and renewal. On Friday, April 9th, the atmosphere around the children of the primordial light reached a grim crescendo. The group gathered in their usual clandestine meeting spot, the dilapidated shed on the outskirts of town, for what they called the initiation ceremony. This event was not merely a ritual, but a decisive turning point for new members. A dark rite designed to solidify loyalty, obedience, and transformation. For Evan Taylor, the ceremony marked the moment when his life would irrevocably change, plunging him deeper into the shadowy world that had claimed him. The initiation ceremony was shrouded in secrecy, known only to those within the group, and whispered about among the most devoted followers. It was said to be the final test of faith and commitment, the point at which the young initiates crossed from tentative acceptance into full-fledged membership. The participants gathered with somber expressions, their faces lit only by flickering candles and the dim glow of lanterns hung in the corner. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and faint traces of animal blood from earlier sacrifices. Silence dominated the room, broken only by the low chanting of prayers to Ra-Valem, the primordial deity whose name invoked both reverence and fear. Evan listened attentively as the group's leaders recited the ancient incantations, their voices deep and hypnotic, weaving a tapestry of dark promises and solemn warnings. At the heart of the ceremony came the moment Evan had been waiting for. His task. The leaders spoke in cryptic terms at first, but the meaning was unmistakable. He was to cleanse the school of deceit. To the uninformed ear, the phrase might have sounded metaphorical, but within the cult's twisted doctrine, it was a clear and chilling command: kill. The simple code word cleanse was the euphemism that concealed the brutal reality of their demand. Evan was instructed to eliminate those who had rejected him, those who had laughed at him, those who stood in his way to acceptance. The directive was cold, clinical, and terrifying in its clarity. By the time the ceremony ended, Evan's mind had been irrevocably altered. The careful indoctrination, the relentless rituals, and the hypnotic chants had eroded his sense of self and replaced it with a singular focus on obedience. His individuality was submerged beneath the weight of the cult's ideology, leaving him a vessel for their dark will. The innocence of a 13-year-old boy was stripped away, replaced by a programmed agent of violence, carrying out orders he barely understood but felt compelled to obey. In the days that followed, Evan prepared for what lay ahead with a chilling determination. He gathered several knives, ordinary kitchen knives, but deadly in his hands. These weapons were carefully concealed in the depths of his backpack, hidden from the prying eyes of teachers, classmates, and family. Each knife represented a tool of his grim mission, a symbol of the transformation he had undergone. His appearance became more deliberate. He chose to wear the same shirt emblazoned with the symbol of Ra-Valem, a dark emblem that marked him as a true follower and served as a talisman of protection and power. This shirt was more than clothing. It was an armor, a declaration of allegiance, and a sign that he was no longer just Evan Taylor, the neglected boy, but a member of the children of the primordial light. As the weekend passed, Evan's thoughts narrowed to the task ahead. The outside world, the school hallways, the classrooms, the familiar faces seemed distant and unreal. His mind was consumed by the cult's teachings and the necessity of the mission. The idea of violence, which would once have horrified him, now felt like an act of purification, a necessary sacrifice to earn his place among his new family. The cult had rewritten his moral compass, painting the world in stark contrasts of purity and corruption, friend and enemy. Those who had rejected or mocked him were no longer fellow students or neighbors. They were obstacles to be removed, threats to the sacred order. Monday morning dawned cold and gray, matching the somber mood that clung to Evan's heart. He woke early, his movements mechanical and precise as he donned the shirt with Ra-Valem's symbol. He slung the backpack heavy with concealed knives over his shoulder, the weight both physical and symbolic. Each step toward the school was a step deeper into a nightmare that would forever alter the lives of many. The bus ride, the walk through the hallways, the faces of classmates, all seemed surreal, as if Evan was observing from a distance, detached and numb. The mission consumed him entirely, eclipsing the remnants of childhood innocence. No one around him suspected what lurked beneath the calm exterior. Teachers greeted him with routine questions about homework and attendance. Classmates exchanged casual hellos, but Evan responded with blank eyes and muted expressions. The school, once a place of learning and social interaction, was now the stage for a horrifying act. orchestrated by a mind no longer his own. The familiar corridors echoed with the normal sounds of adolescent chatter and footsteps, masking the dark intentions that moved silently among them. The transformation of Evan Taylor from a quiet, neglected boy into a conditioned instrument of the cult's violence was complete. The initiation ceremony had sealed his fate, binding him irrevocably to the children of the primordial light and their twisted vision. His actions in the coming days would send shockwaves through the community, shattering the fragile peace and exposing the chilling power of manipulation and control. This moment, the decision to act on the cult's command, was the culmination of weeks of psychological conditioning, isolation, and indoctrination. It marked the loss of Evan's autonomy and the emergence of a darker force within him. The mission to cleanse the school of deceit was not just a task, it was a final betrayal of everything he had once been. A tragic surrender to the sinister influence that had taken root in his young mind. The day unfolded like any other at the small Texas high school, students milling through hallways, laughing in clusters, and gathering in the bustling cafeteria for lunch. The air was thick with the familiar sounds of chatter and clinking trays, a symphony of adolescent life echoing within the walls. Yet beneath the surface of normalcy, a terrifying storm was about to break loose, one that would shatter the illusion of safety and change the lives of many forever. Evan Taylor moved through the crowded cafeteria with a cold detachment that went unnoticed by most. His face was expressionless, eyes distant and unfocused, yet the danger he carried was palpable. The knives he had concealed within his backpack were now close at hand, his grip tightening with each passing moment. To the untrained eye, he might have appeared as just another withdrawn teenager navigating the chaotic lunch hour. But Evan's mind was no longer his own. It was consumed by the dark commands of the cult that had claimed him, driving him toward an act of violence that few could comprehend. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. Without warning, Evan unleashed a wild, frenzied attack on his unsuspecting classmates. The screams that erupted were chilling, words that no one could understand, uttered in a voice filled with raw terror and conviction. The suddenness of the assault threw the cafeteria into chaos. Students scattered in panic, desperately seeking escape from the horrific scene unfolding around them. Tables were overturned, trays and food abandoned as screams filled the air, and the once lively room became a scene of confusion and fear. Amid the chaos, a gym teacher, a man known for his calm demeanor and quick reflexes, stepped forward to confront Evan. Despite the danger, he moved toward the boy with the intent to stop the violence. The teacher's intervention was heroic but costly. He sustained severe injuries while wrestling with Evan, the struggle intense and desperate. Yet, despite the pain and blood, the teacher managed to wrest the knife away from Evan's grasp, halting the attack before it could escalate further. The aftermath of Evan's rampage was devastating. 2 students lost their lives, victims of the senseless violence that erupted in what should have been a safe place of learning and friendship. 3 others were left with serious injuries, wounds that would leave physical scars and emotional trauma that lingered long after the wounds healed. The school community was plunged into grief and shock, grappling with the horror that had invaded their everyday lives. Police arrived swiftly, responding to the emergency calls flooding in from the school. They found Evan still in the cafeteria, the scene of devastation surrounding him like a dark cloud. Remarkably, Evan did not resist arrest. Instead, he stood quietly as officers approached, his expression eerily calm, almost serene. A faint smile played on. The smile seemed to reflect a mind detached from reality, one deeply ensnared in the cult's influence and the twisted sense of purpose it had instilled in him. The arrest was quick and efficient. Officers handcuffed Evan and led him away from the scene, his compliance and unsettling demeanor raising questions that would haunt investigators for years. The boy who had been invisible and neglected had become the center of a tragedy that rippled through the community, challenging the very notions of innocence and evil. In the days that followed, the community struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The lives lost and forever changed weighed heavily on the hearts of students, teachers, and families alike. The school, once a place of learning and laughter, was now a somber reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. Evan's actions were dissected by authorities, psychologists, and the media. Questions abounded about how a child so young could commit such atrocities, what influences had shaped him, and how such a tragedy could have been prevented. The answers pointed toward a chilling reality: a vulnerable boy manipulated and consumed by a cult's poisonous ideology, driven to violence under the guise of cleansing and acceptance. This violent outburst in the cafeteria marked the culmination of weeks of manipulation and isolation. It was a moment when a fractured mind, overwhelmed by darkness, crossed a point of no return. The echo of that day's screams would linger in the memories of all who witnessed it, a haunting testament to the devastating consequences of neglect, manipulation, and lost innocence. The community's healing would be long and difficult, but the events of that day served as a grim warning of the depths to which a vulnerable child can be driven when left unseen and unheard. Evan Taylor's violent act was not just a tragedy of loss, but a profound failure of awareness and intervention, a stark reminder of the urgent need to protect and support those teetering on the edge before they fall. During the interrogation that followed Evan's arrest, the boy's demeanor was strikingly calm and detached. At just 13 years old, he faced questions about the horrific events with an unsettling steadiness that left investigators both confused and uneasy. There were no tears, no cries of remorse, no visible signs of the anguish that many would expect from someone so young, caught in such a tragedy. Instead, Evan repeated a chilling refrain over and over: "I cleansed them. I am one of us now." The phrase echoed through the sterile interrogation room like a mantra, revealing the depth of his indoctrination and the fractured state of his mind. No apologies crossed his lips. No expressions of pain or regret surfaced. The boy seemed to exist in a world detached from conventional understanding of guilt or suffering, bound instead by the dark ideology that had consumed him. His words carried the weight of conviction, a terrifying testament to the power the cult had over his thoughts and identity. The notion of cleansing was not a metaphor but a literal justification for his violent actions, a way to reconcile the horror he had inflicted with the warped beliefs instilled in him. To Evan, he was no longer an isolated child acting out of despair or confusion. He was a member of a group, a participant in a sacred mission. The transformation was profound and heartbreaking, as the innocence of a boy was eclipsed by the shadow of fanaticism. Because of his age and mental state, the legal system deemed Evan not criminally responsible for his actions. The recognition was that his capacity to understand the full gravity of his deeds had been eroded by the psychological manipulation he had suffered. Instead of facing traditional punishment, he was placed in a juvenile psychiatric facility, a place intended to provide treatment and rehabilitation rather than retribution. This decision underscored the complexity of his case, where accountability was intertwined with vulnerability and exploitation. The hope was that, removed from the cult's influence and provided with proper care, Evan might one day reclaim the fragments of a life stolen from him by darkness. Meanwhile, investigators turned their focus to uncovering the full extent of the cult that had ensnared Evan. Their inquiries led them beyond the school and the immediate circle of followers, delving into the shadowy network that had operated in secrecy for months, perhaps years. Law enforcement searched the homes and properties of adult members, unearthing disturbing evidence that painted a broader picture of the cult's activity. In one such residence, officers discovered a trove of chilling materials, diaries filled with cryptic entries detailing rituals and beliefs, audio and video recordings capturing ceremonies that revealed the group's sinister practices, and evidence of mutilated animals, remnants of sacrifices carried out in the name of Ra-Valine. Perhaps most unsettling were the lists of candidates, names carefully compiled and marked for recruitment or initiation. These lists indicated a wider network of influence, suggesting the cult's reach extended far beyond the town where Evan lived. The scale of their operations hinted at a disturbing capacity to manipulate and control others, preying on vulnerable individuals like Evan to swell their ranks. The cult members who had not yet been apprehended had scattered, slipping through the cracks and leaving trails that led to other states. This dispersal complicated efforts to dismantle the organization completely, turning the investigation into a broader pursuit that stretched across state lines. Authorities issued alerts and coordinated with various law enforcement agencies to track down those who continued to evade capture. The elusive nature of the group underscored the challenge of confronting secretive and insidious organizations that thrive in the shadows. The revelation of the cult's existence sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. What had once been dismissed as a minor youth group was now exposed as a dangerous and manipulative sect, capable of inspiring violence and terror. The public grappled with the horror of how such a group had operated unnoticed, ensnaring a young boy and compelling him to commit unspeakable acts. Questions arose about how many others might have been drawn into the cult's fold, and how communities could better protect their vulnerable members from similar fates. For Evan, the path ahead was uncertain. The psychiatric facility where he was placed offered a chance for healing, but the scars, both physical and psychological, would remain. His journey would be one of recovery, facing the immense task of disentangling himself from the dark beliefs that had consumed his mind and rebuilding an identity shattered by manipulation and violence. His case would become a poignant example of the complex intersections between mental health, criminal responsibility, and the dangers of cult influence. The investigators' work continued, their efforts focused on not only apprehending remaining members, but also understanding the mechanisms by which the cult operated. They sought to uncover the psychological tactics used to recruit and control, aiming to develop strategies to prevent such tragedies in the future. The hope was that by shedding light on the cult's inner workings, communities could be better equipped to recognize warning signs and intervene before vulnerable individuals were drawn into darkness. In the wake of these discoveries, the community faced a difficult reckoning. The trust once placed in the safety of familiar institutions was shaken, replaced by a cautious vigilance. Parents, educators, and leaders sought answers, striving to comprehend how a young boy could be so profoundly influenced and where the system had failed. The story of Evan Taylor and the children of the primordial light became a somber lesson, a reminder of the hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface of ordinary life and the critical importance of compassion, awareness, and early intervention. Evan Taylor's story goes far beyond the tragedy of a single boy caught in darkness. It is a stark reflection of what can happen when a child is left to navigate the complexities of the world alone, without guidance, understanding, or care. When the pain a child carries goes unseen and unheard, it grows in silence, festering beneath the surface until it shapes every thought, every feeling, and every decision. Evan's journey is a heartbreaking example of how isolation and neglect can leave a vulnerable soul exposed to forces that prey on desperation and longing. In the absence of love and connection, a child's mind becomes a fertile ground for manipulation. The innocent search for acceptance, for warmth, for belonging can lead down perilous paths. Those who promise love, attention, and purpose, no matter how twisted their true intentions, can wield immense power over a young and impressionable heart. For Evan, the dark embrace of the cult was not just a refuge. It became the only source of identity and value he had ever known. The love he found was not the gentle, nurturing kind that heals and strengthens, but a cold, coercive love, bound to violence and obedience. This story highlights the fragile nature of childhood when surrounded by indifference. It reveals how easily pain can be masked by silence and how often cries for help go unnoticed. Evan's transformation was not simply the result of his own choices, but the product of a system that failed to protect him, a community that overlooked his suffering and allowed darkness to fill the void left by neglect. His path illustrates the devastating consequences when a child's emotional needs are unmet and their vulnerability exploited. Evan's experience serves as a haunting reminder that the search for love is universal and profound. Every child deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. When that fundamental need is denied, the consequences can be tragic. It shows us the importance of vigilance, compassion, and intervention. To reach out before the silence becomes too deep, before the darkness becomes too strong. Evan Taylor's story is a call to recognize and nurture the invisible struggles of children around us, to prevent another soul from being lost to the shadows, where love wears the mask of a knife.